Here. Hi, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. You're here with Fanbase. And I'm going to pop over now to chapter 2. All right, everyone. We're here tonight. Let us begin. We are here, chapter 2, for The Law and the Promise by Neville Goddard. Making sure volume is all the way. Chapter 2, Dwell Therein. My God, I heard this day that none doth build a stately habitation, but he that means to dwell therein. What house more stately hath there been or can be than is man, to whose creation all things are in decay? George Herbert. I wish it were true of man's noble dreams. But unfortunately, perpetual construction, deferred occupancy, is the common fault of man. Why build a stately habitation unless you intend to dwell therein? Why build a dream house and not dwell therein? This is the secret of those who lie in bed awake while they dream things true. They know how to live in their dream until, in fact, they do just that. Man, through the medium of a controlled waking dream, can predetermine his future. That imaginal activity of living in the feeling of the wish fulfilled leads man across a bridge of incident to the fulfillment of the dream. If we live in the dream, thinking from it and not of it, then the creative power of imagining will answer our adventurous fancy, and the wish fulfilled will break in upon us and take us unawares. Man is all imagination. Therefore, man must be where he is in imagination, for his imagination is himself. To realize that imagination is not something tied to the senses or enclosed within the spatial boundary of the body is most important. Although man moves about in space by movement of his physical body, he need not be so restricted. He can move by a change in what he is aware of. However real the scene on which sight rests, man can gaze on one never before witnessed. He can always remove the mountain if it upsets his concept of what life ought to be. This ability to mentally move from things as they are to things as they ought to be is one of the most important discoveries that man can make. It reveals man as a center of imagining with powers of intervention which enable him to alter the course of observed events, moving from success to success through a series of mental transformations of nature, of others, and himself. For many years, a doctor and his wife dreamed about their stately habitation, but not until they imaginatively lived in it did they manifest it. Here is their story. Some 15 years ago, Mrs. M and I purchased a lot on which we built a 2-story building housing our office and living area. We left ample space on the lot for an apartment building, if and when our finances would permit. All those years we were busy paying off our mortgage, and at the end of that time had no money for the additional building we still desired so much. It was true that we had an ample savings account, which meant security for our business, but to use any part of it for a new building would be to jeopardize that security. But now your teaching awakened a new concept, boldly telling us we could have what we most desired through the controlled use of our imagination, and that realizing a desire was made more convincing without money. We decided to put it to a test, to forget about money, and concentrate our attention on the thing we desired most in this world, the new apartment building. With this principle in mind, we mentally constructed the new building as we wanted it, actually drawing physical plans so we could better formulate our mental picture of the completed structure. never forgetting to think from the end, in our case, the completed, occupied building. We took many imaginative trips through our apartment house, renting the units to imaginary tenants, examining in detail every room, and enjoying the feeling of pride as friends offered congratulations on the unique planning. We brought into our imaginal scene one friend in particular. I shall call her Mrs. X, a lady we had not seen for some time, as she had given us up socially, believing us a bit peculiar in our new way of thinking. In our imaginal scene, we took her through the building and asked how she liked it. Hearing her voice distinctly, we had her reply, "Why, doctor, I think it is beautiful." One day, while talking together of our building, my wife mentioned a contractor who had constructed several apartment houses in our neighborhood. We knew of him only by the name that appeared on signs adjacent to buildings under construction. But realizing that if we were living in the end, we would not be looking for a contractor, we promptly forgot this angle. Continuing these periods of daily imagining for several weeks, we both felt we were now fused with our desire and had successfully been living in the end. One day, a stranger entered our office and identified himself as the contractor whose name my wife had mentioned weeks before. In an apologetic manner, he said, I don't know why I stopped here. I normally don't go to see people, but rather people come to see me. He explained that he passed our office often and had wondered why there wasn't an apartment building on the corner lot. Well, we assured him we would like very much to have such a building there, but that we had no money to put into the project, not even the few $100s it would take for the plans. Our negative response did not faze him, and seemingly compelled, he began to figure and devise ways and means to carry out the job, unasked and unencouraged by us. Forgetting the incident, we were quite startled when a few days later this man called, informing us that plans were completed and that the proposed building would cost us $30,000. We thanked him politely and did absolutely nothing. We knew we had been living imaginatively in the end of a completed building, and that imagination would assemble that building perfectly without any outside assistance from us. So we were not surprised when the contractor called again the next day to say he had found a set of blueprints in his files that fitted our needs perfectly with few alterations. This, we were informed, would save us the architect's fee for new plans. We thanked him again and still did nothing. Logical thinkers would insist that such negative response from prospective customers would completely end the matter. Instead, 2 days later, the contractor again called with the news that he had located a finance company willing to cover the necessary loan with the exception of a few $1,000s. It sounds incredible, but we still did nothing. For remember, to us, this building was completed and rented, and in our imagination, we had not put one penny into its construction. The balance of this tale reads like a sequel to Alice in Wonderland. For the contractor came to our office the next day and said, as though presenting us with a gift, "You people are going to have that new building anyway. I've decided to finance the balance of the loan myself. If this is agreeable, I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers and you can pay me back out of net profits from rentals." This time we did do something. We signed the papers and construction began immediately. Most of the apartment units were rented before final completion, and all but one occupied the day of completion. We were so thrilled by the seemingly miraculous events of the past few months that for a while we didn't understand this seeming flaw in our imaginal picture. But knowing what we had already accomplished through the power of imagining, we immediately conceived another imaginal scene, and in it, this time, instead of showing the party through the unit and hearing the words "we'll take it," We ourselves, in imagination, visited tenants who had already moved in that apartment. We allowed them to show us through the rooms and heard their pleased and satisfied comments. 3 days later, that apartment was rented. Our original imaginary drama had objectified itself in every detail save one. And that one became a reality when 1 month later our friend, Mrs. X, surprised us with a long overdue visit, expressing her desire to see our new building. Gladly we took her through, and at the end of the tour, heard her speak the line we had heard in our imagination so many weeks before, as with emphasis on each word she said, "Doctor, I think it is beautiful." Our dream of 15 years was realized. And we know now that it could have been realized any time within those 15 years if we had known the secret of imagining and how to live in the end of desire. But now it was realized. Our one big desire was objectified, and we did not put one penny of our own money into it. Dr. M. Through the medium of a dream, a controlled waking dream, the doctor and his wife created reality. They learned how to live in their dream house, as in fact now they do. Although help seemingly came from without, the course of events was ultimately determined by the imaginal activity of the doctor and his wife. The participants were drawn into their imaginal drama because it was dramatically necessary that they should be. Their imaginal structure demanded it. All things by a law divine in one another's being mingle. The following story illustrates the way in which a lady prepared her stately habitation by imaginatively sleeping in it or dwelling therein. A few months ago, my husband decided to place our home on the market. The main object for the move, which we had discussed many times, was to find a home large enough for the two of us, my mother and my aunt, in addition to 10 cats, 3 dogs, and 1 parakeet. Believe it or not, the contemplated move was my husband's idea, as he loved my mother and aunt and said I was at their houses most of the time anyway, so why not live together and pay one tax bill? I liked the idea tremendously, but I knew that this new home would have to be something very special in size, location, and arrangement, as I insisted on privacy for all concerned. So, at the moment, I was undecided whether to sell our present home or not. But I didn't argue, as I knew quite well from past experience with imagining that our house would never sell until I stopped sleeping in it. 2 months and 4 or 5 real estate brokers later, my husband had given up on the sale of our house, and so had the brokers. At this point, I had convinced myself I now wanted the change. So for 4 nights, in my imagination, I went to sleep in the kind of home I would like to own. On the 5th day, my husband had an appointment at a friend's home, and while there, met a stranger who just happened to be looking for a house in the hills. He was, of course, brought swiftly back to see our house, which he walked through once and said, "I'll buy it." This didn't make us very popular with the brokers, but that was all right with me, as I was happy to keep the broker's commission in the family. We moved within 10 days and stayed with my mother while looking for our new home. We listed our requirements with every agent on the Sunset Strip, only because I wouldn't move out of the area, and each one of them, without exception, informed us we were both mad. It was entirely impossible, they said, to find an older home of English style with 2 separate living rooms, separate apartments, a library, and built on a flat knoll with enough ground space to fence for large dogs and located in one particular area. When we told them the price we would pay for this house, they just looked sad. I said that wasn't all we wanted. We wanted wood paneling all through the house, a huge fireplace, a magnificent view, and seclusion. No close neighbors, please. At this point, the lady agent would giggle and remind me that there was no such house. But if there were, they would realize 5 times what we were willing to pay. But I knew there was such a house because my imagination had been sleeping in it. And if I am my imagination, then I had been sleeping in it. By the second week, we had exhausted 5 real estate offices, and the gentleman in the 6th house was looking a little wild when one of his partners, who had not spoken until then, said, "Why don't you show them the place up Kings Road?" A third partner in the office laughed sourly and said, "That property isn't even listed. And besides, the old lady would throw us off the property. She's got 2 acres up there, and you know she wouldn't split." Well, I didn't know what she wouldn't split. But my interest had been aroused by the street name, for I liked that particular area best of all. So I asked, why not just take a look anyway for laughs? As we drove up the street and turned off onto a private road, we approached a large 2-story house built of redwood and brick, English in appearance, surrounded by tall trees, and sitting alone and aloof on its own knoll, viewing the city below from all of its many windows. I felt a peculiar excitement as we walked to the front door and were greeted by a lovely woman who graciously asked us in. I do not think I breathed for the next minute or two, for I had walked into the most exquisite room I had ever seen. The solid redwood walls and the brick of a great fireplace rose to a height of 28 feet, terminating in an arched ceiling joined together by huge redwood beams. The room was straight out of Dickens, and I could almost hear Christmas carolers singing on the balcony of the upstairs dining room, which looked out over the living room. A great cathedral window gave a view of sky, mountains, and city far below, and the beautiful old redwood walls glowed in the sunlight. We were shown through a spacious apartment on the lower floor with connecting library, separate entrance, and separate patio. 2 staircases led upward to a long hall opening into 2 separated bedrooms and baths, and at the end of the hall was, yes, a second living room opening out onto a second patio screened by trees and redwood fencing. Built on 2 acres of beautifully landscaped grounds, I began to understand what the agent had meant by saying she wouldn't split. For 1 acre stood a large swimming pool and a pool house completely separated from the main house, but undoubtedly belonging to it. It did indeed seem to be an impossible situation, as we did not want 2 acres of highly taxable property plus a swimming pool a block away from the house. Before we left, I walked through that magnificent living room once more, going up the stairs to the dining room balcony. I turned, and looking down, saw my husband standing by the fireplace, pipe in hand, with an expression of perfect satisfaction on his face. I placed my hands on the balcony railing and watched him for a moment. Then we were back in the real estate office. The 3 agents were ready to close for the day, but my husband detained them, saying, "Let's make her an offer anyway. Maybe she will split the property. What can we lose?" 1 agent left the office without a word. Another said, "The idea is ridiculous." The agent we had originally talked to said, "Forget it. It's a pipe dream." My husband is not easily annoyed, but when he is, there's no more stubborn creature on earth. He was now annoyed. He sat down, slammed his hand on a desk, and roared, "It's your business to submit offers, isn't it?" They agreed that this was so, and finally promised to submit our offer on the property. We left, and that night, in my imagination, I stood on that dining room balcony and looked down at my husband standing by the fireplace. He looked up at me and said, "Well, honey, How do you like our new home? I said, I love it. I continued to see that beautiful room and my husband in it, and felt the balcony railing gripped in my hands until I fell asleep. The next day, as we were having dinner in my mother's house, the telephone rang, and the agent, in an unbelieving voice, informed me that we had just purchased the house. The owner had split the property right down the middle, giving us the house and the acre it stood on for the price we offered. JRB. Dreamers often lie in bed awake while they do dream things true. One must adopt either the way of imagination or the way of sense. No compromise or neutrality is possible. He who is not for me is against me. When man finally identifies himself with his imagination rather than his senses, he has at long last discovered the core of reality. I have often been warned by self-styled realists that man will never realize his dream by simply imagining that it is already here. Yet, man can realize his dream by simply imagining that it is already here. That is exactly what this collection of stories prove. If only men were prepared to live imaginatively in the feeling of the wish fulfilled, advancing confidently in their controlled waking dream, then the power of imagining would answer their adventurous fancy, and the wish fulfilled would break in upon them and take them unawares. Nothing is more continuously wonderful than the things that happen every day to the man with imagination sufficiently awake to realize their wonder. Observe your imaginal activities. Imagine better than the best you know, and create a better world for yourself and others. Live as though the wish had come, even though it is yet to come, and you will shorten the period of waiting. Live as though the wish had come, even though it is yet to come, and you will shorten the period of waiting. The world is imaginal, not mechanistic. Imaginal acts, not blind faith, determine the course of history. Chapter 3. Turn the wheel backward. Oh, let your strong imagination turn the great wheel backward until Troy unburn. All life is, throughout the ages, nothing but the continuing solution of a continuous synthetic problem. H.G. Wells. The perfectly stable or static state is always unattainable. The end attained objectively always realizes more than the end the individual originally had in view. This, in turn, creates a new situation of inner conflict, needing novel solutions to force man along the path of creative evolution. His touch is infinite and lends a yonder to all ends. Today's events are bound to disturb yesterday's established order. The creatively active imagination invariably unsettles a pre-existing peace of mind. The question may arise as to how. By representing others to ourselves as better than they really were, or mentally rewriting a letter to make it conform to our wish, or by revising the scene of an accident, the interview with the employer, and so on, could change what seems to be the unalterable facts of the past. But remember my claims for imagining. Imagining creates reality. What it makes, it can unmake. It is not only conservative, building a life from images supplied by memory. It is also creatively transformative, altering a theme already in being. The parable of the unjust steward gives the answer to this question. We can alter our world by means of a certain illegal imaginal practice, by means of a mental falsification of the facts, That is, by means of a certain intentional imaginal alteration of that which we have experienced. All this is done in one's own imagination. This is a form of falsehood which not only is not condemned, but is actually approved in the gospel teachings. By means of such a falsehood, a man destroys the causes of evil and acquires friends, and on the strength of this revision proves, judging by the high praise the unjust steward received from his master, that he is deserving of confidence. Because imagining creates reality, we can carry revision to the extreme and revise a scene that would be otherwise unforgivable. We learn to distinguish between man, who is all imagination, and those states into which he may enter. An unjust steward looking at another's distress will represent the other to himself as he ought to be seen. Were he himself in need, he would enter his dream in his imagination and imagine what he would see and how things would seem and how people would act after these things should be. Then, in this state, he would fall asleep, feeling the way he would expect to feel under such circumstances. Would that all the Lord's people were unjust stewards, mentally falsifying the facts of life to deliver individual forevermore. For the imaginal change goes forward until at length the altered pattern is realized on the heights of attainment. Our future is our imaginal activity in its creative march. Imagine better than the best you know. To revise the past is to reconstruct it with new content. Man should daily relive the day as he wished he had lived it, revising the scenes to make them conform to his ideals. For instance, suppose today's mail brought disappointing news. Revise the letter, mentally rewrite it, and make it conform to the news you wish you had received. Then, in imagination, read the revised letter over and over again, and this will arouse the feeling of naturalness, and imaginal acts become facts as soon as we feel natural in the act. This is the essence of revision, and revision results in repeal. This is exactly what F.B. did. Late in July, I wrote to a real estate agent of my desire to sell a piece of land, which had been a financial burden to me. His negative reply listed all the reasons why sales were at a standstill in that area, and he forecast a bleak period of waiting until after the first of the year. I received his letter on a Tuesday, and in my imagination, I rewrote it with words indicating that the agent was eager to take my listing. I read this revised letter over and over, and I extended my imaginal drama using your theme of the four mighty ones of our imagination from your book, Seed, Time, and Harvest. Well, I guess we know what's next. The producer, the author, the director, and the actor. In my imaginal scene as producer, I suggested the theme. The lot is sold for a profit. As the author, I wrote this simple scene, which to me implied fulfillment. Standing in the real estate office, I extended my hand to the agent and said, "Thank you, sir." And he replied, "It was a pleasure doing business with you." As director, I rehearsed myself as actor until that scene was vividly real, and I felt the relief which would be mine if the burden were really lifted. 3 days later, the agent I had originally written phoned me saying he had a deposit for my lot at the price I had specified. I signed the papers in his office the next day. extended my hand and said, "Thank you, sir." The agent replied, "It was a pleasure doing business with you." 5 days after I had constructed and enacted an imaginal scene, it became a physical reality and was played word for word just as I had heard it in my imagination. The feeling of relief and joy came not so much from selling the property, but from the incontrovertible proof that my imagined drama worked. FB. If the thing accomplished were all, how futile. But FB discovered a power within himself that can consciously create circumstances. By mentally falsifying the facts of life, man moves from passive reaction to active creation. This breaks the wheel of recurrence and builds a cumulatively enlarging future. If man does not always create in the full sense of the word, it is because he is not faithful to his vision, or else he thinks of what he wants rather than from his wish fulfilled. Man is such an extraordinary synthesis. Blah. Man is such an extraordinary synthesis, partly tied by his senses and partly free to dream, that his internal conflicts are perennial. The state of conflict in the individual is expressed in society. Life is a romantic adventure. To live creatively, imagining novel solutions to ever more complex problems, is far nobler than to restrain or kill out desire. All that is desired can be imagined into existence. Wouldst thou be in a dream and yet not sleep? Try to revise your day every night before falling asleep. Try to visualize clearly and enter into the revised scene, which would be the imaginal solution of your problem. The revised imaginal structure may have a great influence on others, but that is not your concern. The other, influenced in the following story, is profoundly grateful for that influence. LSE writes, "Last August, while on a blind date, I met the man I wanted to marry. This happens sometimes, and it happened to me. He was everything I had ever thought of as a desirable in a husband. 2 days after this enchanted evening, it was necessary for me to change my place of residence because of my work. And that same week, the mutual friend who had introduced me to this man moved away from the city. I realized that the man I had met probably did not know of my new address, and frankly, I was not sure he knew my name. After your last lecture, I spoke to you of this situation. Although I had plenty of other dates, I could not forget this one man. Your lecture was based on revising our day. And after speaking to you, I determined to revise my day every day. Before going to sleep that night, I felt I was in a different bed in my own home as a married woman, and not as a single working girl sharing an apartment with 3 other girls. I twisted an imaginary wedding band on my imaginary left hand, saying over and over to myself, 'This is wonderful. I really am Mrs. J.E.' And I fell asleep in what was, a moment before, a waking dream. I repeated this imaginary scene for 1 month, night after night. The first week in October, he found me on our second date. I knew my dreams were rightly placed. Your teachings tell us to live in the end of our desire until that desire becomes fact. So although I did not know how he felt toward me, I continued night after night living in the feeling of my dream realized. The results? In November, He proposed. In January, we announced our engagement, and the following May, we were married. The loveliest part of it all, however, is that I am happier than I ever dreamed possible, and I know in my heart he is too. Mrs. J.E. By using her imagination radically instead of conservatively, by building her world out of pure dreams of fancy rather than using images supplied by memory, she brought about the fulfillment of her dream. Common sense would have used images supplied by her memory and thereby perpetuated the fact of lack in her life. Imagination created what she desired out of a dream of fancy. Everyone must live wholly on the level of imagination, and it must be consciously and deliberately undertaken. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies, that apprehend more than cool reason overcomprehends. If our time of revision be well spent, we need not worry about results. Our fondest hopes will be realized. Art thou real, earth? Am I? In whose dream do we exist? There is no inevitable permanence in anything. There is no inevitable permanence in anything. Both past and present continue to exist only because they are sustained by imagining on some level or other. And a radical transformation of life is always possible by man revising the undesirable part of it. In his letter, Mr. R.S. questions this subject of influence. During your current series of lectures, trouble developed with collections on one of my trust deeds. The security, a house and lot, was neglected and run down. The owners were apparently spending their money in bars while their two little girls, aged 9 and 11, were noticeably uncared for. However, forgetting appearances, I began to revise the situation. In my imagination, I drove my wife past the property and said to her, "Isn't the yard beautiful? It's so neat and well cared for. Those people really show their love for their home. This is one trust deed we will never have to worry about." I would see the house and lot as I wanted to see it. A place so lovely, it gave me a warm glow of pleasure. Every time the thought of this property came to me, I repeated my imaginal scene. After I had been practicing this revision for some time, the woman who lived in the house had an automobile accident. While she was in the hospital, her husband disappeared. The children were cared for by neighbors, and I was tempted to visit the mother in the hospital to reassure her of assistance if necessary. But how could I, when my imaginary scene implied that she and her family were happy, successful, and obviously contented? So I did nothing but my daily revision. A short while after leaving the hospital, the woman and her two daughters disappeared also. Payments were sent in on the property, and a few months later she reappeared with a wedding certificate and a new husband. At this writing, all payments are right up to date. The two little girls are obviously happy and well cared for, and a room has been added to the property by the owners, giving our trust deed additional security. It was mighty nice to solve my problem without threats, unkind words, eviction, or worry about the little girls. But was there something in my imagining that sent that woman to the hospital? R.S. Any imaginal activity acquiring intensity through our concentrated attention to clarity of the end desired tends to overflow into regions beyond where we are. But we must leave it to take care of such imaginal activity itself. It is marvelously resourceful in adapting and adjusting means to realize itself. Once we think in terms of influence rather than of clarity of the end desired, The effort of imagination becomes an effort of will, and the great art of imagining is perverted into tyranny. Huh? Once we think in terms of influence rather than of clarity of the end desired, the effort of imagination becomes an effort of will, and the great art of imagining is perverted into tyranny. The buried past usually lies deeper than our surface mind can plumb. But fortunately for this lady, she remembered and proved that the made past can be unmade through revision. For 39 years, I had suffered from a weak back. The pain would increase and decrease, but would never leave completely. The condition had progressed to the point where I used medical treatment almost constantly. The doctor would put the hip right for the moment, but the pain simply would not go away. One night, I heard you speak of revision and wondered to myself if a condition of almost 40 years could be revised. I had remembered that at the age of 3 or 4 years, I had fallen backward from a very high swing and had been quite ill at that time because of a serious hip injury. From that time on, I had never been completely free from pain and had paid many a dollar to alleviate the condition to no avail. This year, during the month of August, the pain had become more intense, and one night I decided to test myself and attempt to revise that ancient accident which had been the cause of so much distress in pain and costly medical fees most of my adult life. Many nights passed before I could feel myself back to the age of childhood play. But I succeeded. One night, I actually felt myself on that swing, feeling the rush of wind as the swing rose higher and higher. As the swing slowed down, I jumped forward, landing solidly and easily on my feet. In the imaginal action, I ran to my mother and insisted that she come watch what I could do. I did it again, jumping down from the swing and landed safely on my 2 feet. I repeated this imaginal act over and over until I fell asleep in the doing of it. Within 2 days, the pain in my back and hip began to recede, and within 2 months, pain no longer existed for me. A condition that had plagued me for more than 39 years, that had cost a small fortune in attempted cure, was no more. L.H. It is to the pruning shears of revision that we owe our prime fruit. Man and his past are one continuous structure. This structure contains all of the past, which has been conserved and still operates below the threshold of his senses to influence the present and the future of his life. The whole is carrying all of its contents with it. Any alteration of content will result in an alteration in the present and the future. The first act of correction or cure is always revise. If the past can be recreated into the present, so can the revised past. And thus, the revised past appears within the very heart of her present life. Not fate, but a revised past brought her good fortune. Make results and accomplishment the crucial test of true imagination, and your confidence in the power of imagination to create reality will grow gradually from your experiments with revision confronted by experience. Only by this process of experiment can you realize the potential power of your awakened and controlled imagination. How much do you owe your master? He said. 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. This parable of the unjust steward urges us to mentally falsify the facts of life, to alter a theme already in being. By means of such imaginative falsehoods, a man acquires friends. As each day falls, mentally revise the facts of life and make them conform to events well worthy of recall. Tomorrow will take up the altered pattern and go forward until at length it is realized on the heights of attainment. The reader will find it worthwhile to follow these clues. Imaginal construction of scenes implying the wish fulfilled, and imaginative participation in these scenes until tones of reality are reached. We are dealing with the secret of imagining, in which man is seen awakening into a world completely subject to his imaginative power. Man can understand recurrence of events well enough, the building of a world from images supplied by memory, things remaining as they are. This gives him a sense of security in the stability of things. However, the presence within him of a power which awakens and becomes what it wills, radically changing its form, its environment, and the circumstances of life, inspire in him a feeling of insecurity, a dreadful fear of the future. Now, it is high time to awake out of sleep and put an end to all the unlovely creations of sleeping man. Revise each day. Let your strong imagination turn the great wheel backward until Troy unburn. There we have the end of chapter 3 of The Law and the Promise. Good night, Marjorie. Rachel. Hello, beautiful. Not stepping with faith. I see you. And for the others who have not made themselves known in the chat, I see you too. I don't know how long chapter 4 is. Well, I think we should end there at chapter 4. Simply because take the time to digest. What will you digest? You have the power to create a most beautiful scene, a lovely scene, something fanciful, beyond anything that you could imagine. Don't use your memory to do it, because the memory has limitations. But use something fanciful to create your scene that you will rehearse over and over and over again. That is one thing we learned tonight. The other thing we learned tonight is to revise. If you have a problem just like the woman did, she went all the way back to the original cause of her injury. And she revised over and over and over a perfect landing like a gymnast. She stuck the landing, perfect 10. And what did it do? It influenced her present time. You see, the past always influences the present and the future. Oh? Fine. Continue to see yourself as less than, the way you learnt to in the past, and see what the present and the future will create. So you see, revise, go back if you can find it, like this lady did, the impetus, the cause, and revise it to perfection. It took her some time, she said, to feel the feeling. But she felt the rush of the swing, yes? And she relived it, sticking that landing. And what happened? Because the past was rewritten, well, then she can't be in pain anymore. She must be free of it. So you see, we learned 2 things tonight. Well, a few. I see you here on Fanbase, but I trust that makes sense to you tonight. Don't waste time in judgment. Don't waste time in beating yourself up or pointing the finger or blaming. Revise. Revise. Go back and see it the way it should have been, and allow it to take on all the tones of reality. Just like the woman said, she swung on that swing until she could feel the rush, and then she landed perfectly. Where? In her imagination. She did it over and over and over again. We also learn not to take no for an answer. From the realtor, he's saying, it's impossible. It is only impossible to him because he does not believe. But to you that believe, well, then all things are possible. Go to the end. How do you want it to play out? Remember, he said, thank you. And the realtor said, oh, it was a pleasure doing business with you. Which meant his wish was fulfilled. It was done. It was finished. So what did this woman do? She said, I tested it for myself. So test it for yourself then. Test it for yourself. And tomorrow night, we will continue with chapter 4. There is no fiction. Chapter 4, from the law and the promise. And of course, he alluded to the follow-up book, Seed Time and Harvest. So you see, as you fall asleep tonight, know what it is that you want. And you put your attention solely upon that short scene that confirms. Remember, thank you. It was a pleasure doing business with you. Remember, that's what he wanted to hear. So he heard it in his imagination over and over and over until he felt the joy of it, the elation of it. That's where your attention is. Not on, but that's not possible, sir. She's never going to split the property. That's not your concern. Name it. Devise the short confirmation scene. And as you rehearse that confirmation scene, notice the word rehearse. Because when you rehearse, you are not tempted to watch it play out. You are fully immersed in acting it out. You have to act it out because that's what you would be doing in the physical world. So do in your imagination, what you would do physically. So act it out, rehearse it, convince your body, because once you have convinced your body does what? Your body shows you the evidence of your conviction. And that, persist in that. And in no time at all, that imaginal act becomes a physical reality. So, my beautiful friends, you know the process. Let's do it. Let's practice. Remember, it has nothing to do with worthy or unworthy. What do you want? Devise the scene. What did the woman do? She twirled that wedding ring on her imaginary finger. She didn't stop to think of the obstacle. Oh my God, he doesn't know where I live. She didn't give it a moment's consideration. Why not? Because where you put your attention, well, you know how that turns out. Put your attention. Oh, but it feels far-fetched. Put your attention and rehearse either what you are saying or what you want to hear or what you want to be doing physically. Rehearse that mentally. That is your only concern. And the law, as it unfolds, will do what it does best. Oh, yes. it'll satisfy you. With what? The physical. It'll show you as within, so without. As above, so below. Cause and effect. It will show you the evidence of your imaginal act. And with that, my beautiful friends, I bid you good night and happy practicing. Much love to you all.